This video I've created a new orchestration called BizTalk Transaction Compensation, and I'm not going to do a full test of this. I'm just going to expose you to the concepts here. And so what we're talking about is transactions, and to do a transaction you actually add a scope shape somewhere in your orchestration. So you find the scope here, which we actually use in other videos, but what we're going to do is we're going to mark that shape as, for instance, atomic or long running. Now if I try to, for instance, flag it first before I've flagged my orchestration as a whole, it probably won't let me do it because it says a non-transaction orchestration cannot contain any other transactions. So what that means is I should click here on the orchestration properties itself and then come down here and go to transaction type and reset that, for instance, to long running. Now I can set the scope to either long running or atomic. So let's make it the long running. Now I do have the scope now, and so what I can do is I can put more than one expression in the scope. Now what most people are familiar with transactions is probably with SQL, or maybe you've played with the DTC, the Microsoft Distributed Transaction Coordinator, before. And the concept is that all these things have to happen or all of them have to fail. So if we, for instance, what if we had a routine here, and I'm not going to write all this code because again it would take a long time to fully demonstrate this. What if I had here some code that said update Oracle database, okay, and then I called some C# routine or whatever to do that. And then here, suppose I update a Microsoft SQL database. So when you actually update two different databases, you do require use of the Microsoft Distributed Transaction Coordinator. And so now we wrapped them in a scope. And so if either one fails, we want the other one to fail. So there are some things, though, for instance, that how do you undo? What if you did a send right here? What if you sent the PO to another company? How do you undo that? And so right here in the scope, you can right-click and you can add, as we've done in other videos, an exception handler, but you can also add a compensation block. And so it detects that a failure occurred, and it says, I want to undo what I've done above. So for instance, if you send a message to another company, you would have to have an agreement with that other company that perhaps you have a way to cancel it. So for instance, if we have another send shape here, we would call this send cancel message. And we'd probably have to have a map here, we'd have to build the cancel message, and then we'd have to send it. And then we might need to undo whatever we did in the database. So if we've updated the database, then right here you would do the reversing code to undo what you've done in the database. If you've written to the disk, see, there's some things you can undo automatically, like databases have the rollback capability, but send messages do not, and writing to the disk does not. So for instance, if you had another shape here that was an expression and you did a write file to disk, well then in the compensation for that you would have to remember the name of the file, and then here you would add an expression shape, and you basically would do a delete file with the same name from disk. So that's some of the very basics of transactions. You can also come over here and you can see there's a timeout that basically says that if this transaction doesn't run within this many seconds, I'm going to consider it to have failed. So you can say here, you give it a time span and you say, for instance, 5 minutes. And if the transaction does not complete in 5 minutes, then that would cause the whole thing to blow up, and then the compensation would execute. So again, sometimes this is needed in your applications. Most of the last, actually I've never used it in any of the applications I've written, because I guess I've not had to deal with, for instance, updating two databases within the same shape or scope. So it is something you should be aware of. And again, doing a full-fledged example of this would probably take an hour or more. So we're just going to expose you to the concept and make sure you know it's there. Again, just to review, it's the scope shape, and then on the scope shape you specify, actually when you first add the scope shape, it'll put the little red symbol here, which indicates you need to specify whether it's long running or atomic, and that's called the transaction type. And you can always change that down here in the property box. So if it's atomic, it's more of a short-term transaction, and it's something that will actually kind of like your orchestration will not ever dehydrate during an atomic transaction. So you would never, for instance, you couldn't really do a receive in an atomic transaction. So I would say most of the time you're probably going to make it long running. Okay, and then again, if it fails, you actually write your own code to roll it back, because you cannot roll back a send, and you can't roll back writing to disk. So that's actually called compensation. You have to undo what you've done by writing your own code and compensating for it. So that concludes this brief overview of transactions and compensation.